My daughter-in-law made me a special tea the night she thought I was finally too old to notice. She brought it to me in my favorite porcelain cup, the one with the thin gold rim my late husband Harold bought me on our 25th anniversary, and she smiled in a way that was almost tender, almost careful, as if she were handling something fragile instead of offering a simple cup of chamomile. I remember the way the kitchen light caught the steam rising between us, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking above the stove, and her voice light, sweet, rehearsed. "It'll help you sleep better, Margaret," she said. "You've seemed so restless lately." I looked at her over the rim before taking a sip, and I smiled back. I have lived in this house for 42 years. I have raised a son here, buried a husband from here, paid every mortgage installment on time, and survived long winters that froze the pipes and summers that warped the porch boards. I know the difference between kindness and calculation. The tea smelled slightly bitter beneath the honey. Not enough for most people to question. Just enough for someone who has brewed her own remedies for decades to pause. I did not pause. I thanked her. I told her she was thoughtful. I carried the cup with steady hands into the living room where her mother, Patricia Collins, sat on my floral sofa scrolling through her phone. Patricia had come to keep me company, which lately seemed to mean observing me the way someone inspects an aging appliance, wondering when it might stop working. I sat down beside her and said, "Patricia, you look tired from the drive. You should have this. Lauren made it fresh." I handed her the cup. Patricia hesitated only a second before accepting. Lauren was still in the kitchen, rinsing something at the sink, her back to us. She did not see the exchange. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the evening news while Patricia sipped slowly, complimenting her daughter's recipe. I did not say another word. An hour later, the house was no longer quiet. But to understand that moment, you have to understand the days leading up to it. For weeks, Lauren had been mentioning my health. She would say it gently, almost apologetically. "You forgot where you left your glasses. Again. You seemed confused about what day it was." Small comments planted like seeds. My son Daniel began repeating them. "Mom, maybe you're just tired. Mom, maybe you shouldn't drive at night. I am 72, not 92. I still balance my own checkbook down to the penny. I still walk 2 miles every morning around the neighborhood lake, even when the wind cuts through my coat." But they spoke about me as if I were fading. Last Tuesday I found a brochure tucked beneath a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. Sunnyvale Assisted Living. Spacious private rooms. Medication management. 24-hour supervision. Supervision. The word lingered in my mind long after I put the paper back exactly where I found it. 2 days later, I stopped by my pharmacy to refill my blood pressure prescription. The young pharmacist, a polite man who has known me for years, glanced at his screen and frowned. "Mrs. Whitmore, did your doctor change your dosage?" he asked. I told him no. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see. There, under my name, was a recent prescription for a strong sleep aid. I had never requested it. I had never picked it up. It had been marked as collected. Collected by a family member. I did not react. I thanked him for the information and drove home slowly, keeping my hand steady on the steering wheel. That evening Lauren offered to make me tea again. She said it had been helping me so much. I told her I preferred water. She insisted. "Just try a little." I watched her measure something from a small amber bottle into the steaming cup before adding honey and a slice of lemon. She turned, smiling as if she were performing a kindness. I thought about the brochure. I thought about the prescription. I thought about how easy it would be, on paper, to show that an elderly woman had become forgetful, sleepy, unable to manage her own affairs. I thought about power of attorney documents that require a signature and a witness. And I decided that if someone believed I was too old to understand what was happening in my own kitchen, they had made their first mistake. So I took the tea. And when the moment came, I gave it to her mother instead. Patricia began to complain about feeling lightheaded approximately 40 minutes after she finished the tea, first in a mild tone, as if she were commenting on the weather, and then with a sharper edge that cut through the quiet living room. She pressed her fingers to her temple and said the room felt warm, too warm, even though the thermostat was set at 70 degrees, and I turned toward her with the same calm expression I had practiced for weeks while listening to subtle conversations about my supposed decline. Lauren rushed in from the kitchen the moment she heard her mother's Voice change, her footsteps quick across the hardwood floor. Her face pale in a way that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with recognition. Daniel followed more slowly, confusion written across his features as he looked from Patricia to me and back again, searching for a narrative that made sense. I stood up carefully and offered Patricia a glass of cold water, telling her that sometimes new herbal blends can be stronger than expected, especially on an empty stomach. Lauren froze for a second, just long enough for me to notice the calculation behind her eyes. Then she forced a tight smile and insisted it must have been something Patricia ate earlier. I watched her closely while she checked her mother's pulse the way someone checks the time, distracted and tense. Patricia did not lose consciousness, she did not collapse, but she did admit that she felt unusually drowsy, unusually heavy, and she asked to lie down in the guest bedroom. I walked with her down the hallway that Harold and I painted a soft cream 20 years ago, passing the framed photographs of birthdays and graduations that once represented security to me, and I helped her settle onto the neatly made bed. Lauren hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands in a performance that would have been convincing if I had not seen the amber bottle in her palm earlier that week. Daniel asked whether we should call a doctor, and I answered before Lauren could speak, saying that it would be wise to at least ask a professional for advice when someone reacts unexpectedly to a drink prepared in our own kitchen. The word prepared lingered in the air like steam from the cup. Lauren immediately objected, saying it was probably just fatigue from the drive, but Daniel had already taken out his phone. While he stepped into the hallway to make the call, I returned to the living room and picked up the empty porcelain cup from the coffee table. There was a faint residue at the bottom, a cloudy swirl beneath the thin line of honey. I carried it quietly into my study and placed it on my desk beside a small glass container I had purchased that afternoon from the pharmacy, a simple test kit designed to detect certain common sedatives. I had not mentioned that purchase to anyone. Earlier that day, after my conversation with the pharmacist, I had driven to a different store 2 towns over and asked careful, measured questions. I have learned that when people assume you are fragile, they stop guarding their steps. I had returned home before Lauren finished her yoga class, placing the kit in my desk drawer beneath old tax returns and Harold's fountain pen. Now with steady hands, I followed the instructions printed in clear black letters. I dipped the strip into what remained of the liquid and waited the required 60 seconds, listening to the muffled sound of Lauren's anxious voice drifting down the hallway. The line appeared gradually, unmistakable even to my aging eyes. Positive. Not for chamomile, not for honey, but for a prescription sleep medication stronger than anything I had ever been advised to take. I folded the test strip into a small envelope and locked it in the bottom drawer. When I re-entered the hallway, Daniel was ending his call, nodding as he thanked the nurse for guidance. They advised monitoring Patricia for worsening symptoms and bringing her in if necessary. Lauren avoided my gaze. I looked directly at her and said in an even tone that it was fortunate the tea had not been meant for someone more sensitive to medications, someone whose blood pressure might drop too low. Daniel turned toward her then, confusion sharpening into something closer to suspicion. Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it again. I did not accuse her. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I suggested that tomorrow we should review all medications kept in the house to ensure that nothing had been mislabeled or misplaced. The word misplaced seemed to strike her harder than any accusation could have. Patricia called out weakly from the bedroom, asking for Lauren. My daughter-in-law hurried past me without a word. I remained in the hallway, resting my hand against the wall Harold once leaned on while teaching Daniel how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. I felt no panic, only clarity. For weeks they had been building a case that I was forgetful, that I was confused, that I needed supervision. Tonight the confusion belonged to someone else, and for the first time since I found that brochure on the counter, I understood that the narrative they were crafting could be rewritten, one careful detail at a time. The following morning the house felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and forces you to listen to your own breathing. Patricia had slept through most of the night in the guest bedroom, waking only once to ask for water, and by sunrise her dizziness had lessened enough for her to sit up against the pillows, pale but alert. Lauren hovered at her bedside with exaggerated concern, smoothing the blanket, adjusting the lamp, speaking in soft reassurances that sounded rehearsed. Daniel stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, watching both of them and then glancing down the hallway toward me as if trying to measure what he did not yet understand. I prepared breakfast as I always do, 2 eggs over easy for Daniel, oatmeal with blueberries for myself, and toast lightly buttered. I did not offer tea, instead I set a glass of orange juice beside each plate and waited. When Lauren finally joined us at the table, her eyes were rimmed red from lack of sleep. But there was something else beneath that fatigue, something guarded. She began explaining that her mother must have reacted poorly to a new herbal blend she had purchased from a boutique shop downtown. She said it was entirely natural, entirely safe, and that perhaps Patricia had been dehydrated. Daniel listened quietly, nodding in places that required no agreement. I took a slow bite of oatmeal and asked, in the calmest tone I could manage, whether she still had the bottle from that boutique shop. Lauren hesitated for half a second before answering that she must have thrown it away. Thrown it away. The words hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. I nodded and said that was unfortunate, because I had intended to bring a sample to my physician later that afternoon to ensure there were no ingredients that could interact with common prescriptions. Daniel looked up at that, his brow furrowing. Lauren's hand tightened around her fork. She asked why I would need to involve a physician when her mother was already feeling better. I explained that at my age, even minor reactions can reveal larger concerns, and that I take such matters seriously. I did not mention the test strip locked in my desk drawer. I did not mention the pharmacist who had confirmed that a prescription sleep aid had been collected in my name. Instead, I stood after breakfast and said I would be stopping by my attorney's office before my doctor's appointment, as I had a few documents to review. Daniel blinked in surprise. Lauren's chair scraped softly against the floor as she shifted. I continued, telling them that after Harold passed, I had updated certain legal papers to ensure clarity regarding my property and medical decisions, and that it seemed wise to review them again in light of recent conversations about my supposed forgetfulness. The word forgetfulness did not come out sharp. It came out measured. Daniel opened his mouth as if to protest that no one had accused me of anything serious, but he did not finish the sentence. Lauren forced a laugh and said that everyone worries about aging parents, that it was only love motivating her suggestions about assisted living. I met her eyes directly and said that love does not require secrecy. Silence settled over the table. Outside, delivery truck rumbled past, and the clock above the stove ticked steadily, indifferent to our shifting balance of power. After clearing my plate, I walked to my study and retrieved the envelope containing the test strip. I placed it into my handbag along with copies of my bank statements and the pharmacy receipt from 2 towns over. I paused at the hallway mirror, studying the reflection of a woman with silver hair pulled neatly back and shoulders still straight despite the years. I did not look confused, I did not look frail. When I stepped back into the kitchen, Daniel was standing alone, staring at the countertop where the brochure from Sunnyvale had once been. He asked quietly whether I truly believed someone would try to make decisions for me without my consent. I answered that belief was not required when evidence begins to collect like snow before a storm. Lauren called from the guest bedroom that Patricia needed help gathering her things. I walked past Daniel and down the hallway, my footsteps even, my pulse steady. This house had witnessed arguments, celebrations, and grief, but it had never before witnessed me being underestimated. That, I realized, was about to change. I drove to my attorney's office just after 10 in the morning, the sky a flat pale blue above the courthouse square, and I parked in the same space Harold used to prefer because it sat directly beneath a maple tree that turned brilliant red every October. The familiarity steadied me. Inside, the receptionist greeted me by name, and that alone was enough to remind me that I was not invisible, not diminished, not someone whose life could be rearranged without her consent. When I explained that I wished to review my durable power of attorney and my medical directives, she did not question my reasoning. She simply nodded and asked me to take a seat. As I waited, I thought about the past few months, about the subtle way Lauren had shifted conversations whenever finances were mentioned, about the afternoon she suggested that managing the household bills must be exhausting for someone my age. Exhausting. I have managed investment accounts, property taxes, and insurance policies for decades. I balanced our checkbook when interest rates climbed above 12% in the 1980s. I negotiated refinancing after Harold's company downsized. Exhaustion has never been my weakness. My attorney, Mr. Carlyle, ushered me into his office and listened carefully as I described the new prescription that had appeared under my name and the reaction Patricia experienced after drinking tea prepared in my kitchen. I did not dramatize. I did not accuse. I simply presented facts the way Harold taught me to present them, one by one, in a calm voice that leaves little room for dismissal. Mr. Carlyle leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, asking whether anyone currently held authority over my medical or financial decisions. I told him that several months ago, at Daniel's urging, I had signed a limited authorization allowing him to speak with my physician in case of emergency. I had trusted that such a measure was practical, not strategic. Mr. Carlyle advised that if I felt my judgment was being questioned or manipulated, I should consider revoking that authorization immediately and appointing a neutral third party instead. Neutral, the word carried weight. I agreed. We drafted new documents on the spot, naming the firm itself as temporary medical liaison and reaffirming that all property decisions required my direct signature in person. When I signed my name, my hand did not tremble. It moved smoothly across the paper, the ink dark and steady. Afterward, I drove to my physician's office for a routine appointment I had scheduled weeks earlier. In the examination room, I explained that I had recently discovered a prescription for a sleep medication under my name that I had never requested. My doctor frowned and pulled up my chart, confirming that he had not authorized such a change. He assured me that no one should be collecting medication on my behalf without written permission and that any signs of unusual drowsiness or confusion warranted investigation. I thanked him and requested that all future prescriptions require in-person verification. He agreed. Without hesitation, by the time I returned home in the late afternoon, the sun cast long shadows across the driveway. Lauren's car was already there. Daniel stood near the garage, pacing slowly, as if rehearsing a conversation. When I stepped out of my vehicle, he approached me with a look I had not seen since he was a teenager caught between truth and loyalty. He asked where I had been. I told him plainly. I said I had reviewed my legal documents and spoken with my physician to ensure there would be no misunderstandings about my health or my capacity. He ran a hand through his hair and said that Lauren had been upset, that she felt accused. I responded that transparency does not accuse, secrecy does. Inside the house, Lauren was seated at the kitchen table, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the surface of the wood as if studying its grain. She looked up when I entered and asked whether I truly believed she intended harm. I met her gaze and answered that belief is not necessary. When patterns begin to form, I reminded her that a prescription had been collected in my name without my knowledge and that a beverage prepared for me had caused her mother to feel unwell. I said that until those facts were explained clearly, I would be taking precautions. Daniel stood between us, the space heavy with unsaid things. I did not raise my voice, I did not threaten. I simply placed my handbag on the counter and removed the envelope containing the test strip. I did not open it. I did not show it. I only let it rest there visible. Lauren's eyes flickered toward it and then away. In that quiet kitchen, beneath the steady ticking of the clock, I understood something with perfect clarity. They had begun constructing a narrative in which I was confused, forgetful, dependent. Now, piece by piece, I was constructing one of my own, grounded in documentation, witnesses, and signatures that could not be dismissed as the ramblings of an aging woman. And for the first time since this careful campaign against me had begun, I felt the balance shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to make the floor beneath all of us feel different. That evening I requested that we all sit down at the dining room table, not as adversaries but as a family that had begun to lose its footing. The same table where Harold once carved the Thanksgiving turkey now felt like a courtroom, polished wood reflecting the overhead light in sharp lines. Daniel looked uneasy as he pulled out a chair, and Lauren lowered herself into her seat with a stiffness that suggested she had already rehearsed her defense. I remained standing for a moment longer, letting the silence settle before I spoke. I told them that I had spent the day reviewing my legal documents and consulting my physician, not because I wished to create conflict but because clarity prevents misunderstandings. Daniel nodded slowly, while Lauren folded her hands together, her wedding ring catching the light. I placed a folder on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of the updated power of attorney, the confirmation from my doctor that no sleep medication had been authorized, and the pharmacy receipt documenting the collection of a prescription under my name. I did not slide the papers toward them immediately. I allowed them to see the weight of the folder first. Lauren asked why I felt the need to involve attorneys and doctors when what happened to her mother had already resolved. I answered that resolved reactions do not erase causes. Daniel's gaze shifted from her to me. I explained that the prescription had been filled using my insurance information and collected without my knowledge, and that such an action required explanation. Lauren insisted there must have been a mistake at the pharmacy. She suggested that perhaps someone else with a similar name had been confused with mine. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I calmly read aloud the date, the time, and the signature recorded at pickup. The signature was not mine. Daniel leaned forward, his expression tightening. He asked Lauren directly whether she had picked up the medication. For a brief second her composure fractured. Then she said she had only intended to help, that she believed I had been struggling with sleep and that she thought having something available would make things easier. Easier. I repeated the word softly. Easier for whom? Daniel inhaled sharply, as if the question had struck deeper than he expected. I continued by explaining that adding medication to a drink without full disclosure was not assistance, it was control. Lauren's face flushed and she argued that she never meant harm, that she was trying to ensure I rested so that I would not appear forgetful or confused. Her words tangled themselves. I held up one hand gently, not to silence her but to steady the conversation. I told them that the narrative forming in this house had begun long before the tea, with subtle comments about my memory and my capacity. I described the brochure for assisted living, the repeated suggestions that I might not manage on my own, the emphasis on supervision. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly as recognition flickered across his features. He admitted that Lauren had raised concerns about my well-being and that he trusted her judgment. I nodded and said trust is powerful, which is why it must be handled with care. I finally slid the folder across the table. Daniel opened it first. Lauren watched him read. The room remained quiet except for the soft rustle of paper. When he reached the physician's confirmation that no sleep aid had been prescribed, he looked up slowly. Lauren attempted to explain again, saying she believed she had permission to act in my best interest. I reminded her that best interest does not mean bypassing consent. I stated clearly that the limited authorization allowing Daniel to speak with my doctor had been revoked that morning and that all future medical and financial decisions would require my direct approval. Daniel's lips parted as if to protest, then closed. I added that I had appointed the law firm as a neutral intermediary to prevent further confusion. Lauren's composure thinned. She asked whether I was trying to remove them from my life. I answered that I was trying to remove ambiguity. The difference matters. The clock above the doorway ticked steadily, indifferent to the tension gathering around the table. I concluded by saying that I did not wish for this situation to escalate, but I would not allow my independence to be quietly rewritten. Daniel closed the folder and rested his hands upon it. For the first time since this began, he looked directly at his wife and asked her, in a voice low but firm, why she had not told him about the prescription. She did not answer immediately. In that silence I felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable. Not anger, not triumph, but accountability beginning to take shape. And I understood that while they had underestimated me, they were now beginning to understand that I had been paying attention all along. After Daniel asked her why she had not told him about the prescription, the silence that followed was not dramatic or loud. It was thin and fragile, like glass under pressure. Lauren finally said she had intended to mention it but did not want to cause unnecessary worry, and that she believed she was protecting him from stress. Protecting. Daniel repeated the word slowly as if testing its shape. I watched my son carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way he leaned back in his chair as if creating distance from something he had not expected to see so clearly. I did not interrupt. I had learned that truth gains strength when it is allowed to stand without commentary. Lauren insisted that she had only wanted to help me rest, that she had seen me rubbing my temples at night and assumed I was overwhelmed. I responded quietly that assumption is not consent. Daniel looked down at the documents again and asked whether the pharmacy had required identification at pickup. I answered, yes. I described how prescriptions are logged, how signatures are recorded, how insurance claims are processed. I did not embellish, I did not accuse. I presented the structure of the system the way one presents the blueprint of a house. Lauren's shoulders sagged slightly as if the weight of that structure pressed against her. She said she had used my information because she believed she was already authorized to assist with my medical needs. I reminded her that authorization does not extend to decisions made without disclosure. Daniel turned toward her more fully then, asking whether she had added the medication to the tea. She hesitated long enough for the answer to form on its own. She admitted that she had crushed a portion of the tablet into the drink, believing it would make me sleep deeply and appear more stable the next day. Stable. I repeated the word in my mind. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as if absorbing the full meaning of what had been said. I kept my voice steady and told them that altering someone's intake without their knowledge erodes trust in a way that is not easily repaired. Lauren's composure fractured further. She began to say that she had been frightened by the idea of my decline, that she worried I would refuse assistance until it was too late. I answered that fear does not justify manipulation. Daniel stood up from the table and walked toward the window, staring out at the driveway where his childhood bicycle once lay abandoned on summer afternoons. I could see him processing not only the incident but the pattern that had led to it. I added that the assisted living brochure had not been an accident either, that its presence on the counter suggested planning rather than spontaneous concern. Lauren looked startled, then defensive, explaining that she had only gathered information in case we needed options. I nodded and said options require conversation, not quiet preparation. Daniel turned back toward us and asked directly whether she had been building a case to demonstrate that I was unable to manage my own affairs. The question hung heavy between them. Lauren's voice softened, almost pleading, as she said she believed she was doing what was best for everyone. I responded that what is best for everyone cannot begin with deception. I reminded them that I had already updated my legal documents that morning and that any further attempts to bypass my consent would not be interpreted as concern but as interference. Daniel returned to his seat slowly. He did not defend her. He did not defend me. He simply absorbed. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the walls closer, the clock louder. I rose from my chair and gathered the folder, placing it back into my handbag with deliberate care. I told them that I was not interested in revenge or punishment, only clarity. I said that from this point forward, all medications in the house would remain in my possession and that any discussion about my future would occur openly, with me present, not around me. Lauren nodded faintly, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Daniel looked at me with something that resembled respect, though it was tinged with regret. As I walked toward the hallway, I felt the air shift again, not dramatically but decisively. The foundation of their quiet narrative had cracked. In its place stood documentation, witnesses, and a mother who was no longer willing to be gently repositioned. I did not feel triumph. I felt alignment, and for the first time in months, I sensed that the direction of this household would no longer be determined in whispers behind closed doors. The next morning the house felt different, not tense in the way it had been but rearranged as if invisible furniture had been moved during the night. Daniel left early for work without his usual light-hearted goodbye. His expression thoughtful, measured. And when the front door closed I stood in the kitchen listening to the echo settle. Lauren remained at the table long after his car pulled out of the driveway, her fingers tracing slow circles along the wood grain. Her posture no longer defensive but uncertain. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, not tea, and sat across from her. The distance between us was no more than 3 feet, yet it felt like the length of the entire hallway. She spoke first, saying she had not realized how serious her actions would appear. I answered that actions do not appear serious, they are serious. She lowered her eyes and said she had felt pressure to manage everything perfectly, to ensure stability in the household, especially after Harold's passing. I told her stability cannot be built on secrecy. Silence filled the space again, but this time it was less brittle. She asked quietly whether I intended to force them to leave the house. The question surprised me not because it was unreasonable, but because it revealed what she feared most. I told her I had no desire to dismantle my son's life. I only wanted my own life to remain intact. She nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction. Later that afternoon Daniel returned home earlier than usual. He asked if we could talk privately in the living room. I agreed and followed him, noticing the way Lauren lingered near the kitchen doorway, listening without appearing to. Daniel sat on the edge of the armchair Harold once favored and rested his elbows on his knees. He said he had spent the day thinking about trust, about how easily it can be redirected. He admitted that when Lauren began raising concerns about my memory, he had believed her because he trusted her perspective more than his own observations. I listened without interruption. He said he now realized he had allowed suggestion to outweigh evidence. I told him that trust is not a flaw, but it must be balanced. He asked whether I truly felt unsafe in my own home. I considered the question carefully before answering. I said I did not feel unsafe, but I had felt repositioned, as if my autonomy were being gently folded away. He winced at that description. I explained that when someone begins to speak about you as though you are absent, even while you are seated at the same table, something fundamental shifts. Daniel nodded and said he should have noticed the pattern sooner. I responded that awareness often arrives quietly, not in dramatic moments but in small accumulations. He then asked whether there was any path forward that did not involve distance. I told him that path depends on transparency, that from this point on no decisions about my health, my finances or my residence would be discussed without me present and informed. He agreed immediately. Lauren stepped into the room then, her expression cautious. She said she understood now that her methods had crossed boundaries. She did not attempt to justify them further. Instead, she asked what she could do to restore trust. I answered honestly that trust cannot be restored through grand gestures. It is rebuilt through consistent respect. The room remained still. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the street, an ordinary sound that felt grounding. Daniel reached across the coffee table and placed his hand over mine, not as a child seeking comfort but as a man acknowledging responsibility. I felt no need to pull away. I also felt no need to soften my stance. I told them both that independence is not negotiable, and that any future concern about my well-being would be addressed openly, with documentation and conversation rather than assumption. Lauren nodded again, this time with less resistance. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. As the afternoon light shifted across the carpet, I realized that the most significant change had not been in the legal documents or the pharmacy records, but in the dynamic itself. The quiet campaign to redefine me had been exposed. In its place stood something clearer, less comfortable perhaps, but honest. And honesty, even when strained, is sturdier than any carefully crafted narrative built in whispers. The following week unfolded with an unfamiliar steadiness, not because everything had been repaired, but because the boundaries were now visible and spoken aloud. Daniel began including me in conversations that previously would have taken place in lowered voices after I had gone upstairs. When mail arrived, it was opened at the table with everyone present. When bills were discussed, figures were read clearly, not summarized. Lauren moved through the house more carefully, not in fear, but in awareness. I observed her without hostility, noting the effort it takes to shift from control to cooperation. One afternoon she approached me while I was watering the hydrangeas near the porch and asked whether we could speak privately. I set the watering can down and nodded. We sat on the wooden bench Harold built years ago, the boards worn smooth by seasons of sun and rain. Lauren said she had scheduled an appointment with a family counselor, and wanted to know whether I would consider attending. I studied her expression for any sign of strategy, but what I saw instead was something quieter, perhaps even sincere. I told her that counseling is not a sign of weakness, but it must be rooted in truth. She agreed. She admitted that her fear of losing control over circumstances had led her to make choices that ignored my autonomy. She said she worried about financial instability, about rising costs, about the unpredictability of aging. I responded that unpredictability exists at every stage of life, not only in mine. What matters is how we respond to it. She listened without interrupting. That alone marked a change. Inside the house, Daniel was reviewing our joint household expenses and suggested we schedule a meeting with a financial planner to ensure clarity for everyone. I appreciated the proposal. Transparency had become our new foundation. Later that evening, as the three of us sat in the living room, Daniel apologized directly for allowing assumptions to guide him. He said he should have trusted his own experiences with me rather than interpretations presented as concern. I accepted his apology without dramatics. I told him that adulthood requires reevaluation, and that sometimes loyalty must be recalibrated. Lauren then apologized for the specific act of altering the drink, acknowledging that it crossed a line that should never have been approached. She did not excuse it. She did not blame stress. She simply stated it plainly. I held her gaze and said that forgiveness is possible when accountability is complete. The room felt lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because it had been named. A few days later we attended the first counseling session together. The office was modest, with neutral walls and soft lighting, and the counselor asked each of us to describe what independence meant. I said independence is the right to make informed decisions about my own body and property. Daniel said independence is balancing support with respect. Lauren said independence is recognizing when help becomes interference. Hearing those definitions spoken aloud created a kind of alignment that had been missing. The counselor emphasized that aging does not equal incapacity, and that fear often disguises itself as management. I noticed Lauren nodding slowly. On the drive home, Daniel reached across the center console and squeezed my hand briefly, not out of obligation but reassurance. The following morning Lauren prepared breakfast and asked openly whether I preferred coffee or tea. The question, simple as it was, carried new weight. I answered coffee. She smiled and poured it without adding anything beyond what I requested. Small gestures matter. Over time, the atmosphere in the house continued to stabilize. The assisted living brochure never returned to the counter. The pharmacy records were corrected. The authorization forms remained updated in my attorney's file. I resumed my morning walks around the neighborhood lake, feeling the crisp air against my face and the steady rhythm of my steps. Neighbors waved as they always had. Nothing about me had changed except the clarity with which I now guarded my boundaries. Inside our home, conversations became more direct. If concerns arose, they were voiced in daylight, not whispered at night. I did not forget what had happened. Memory is not something I misplace, but I allowed room for recalibration. The quiet campaign that once attempted to redefine me had dissolved under scrutiny. In its place stood a structure built on open discussion, documented understanding, and a renewed awareness that independence is not surrendered through age, nor regained through anger, but maintained through steady insistence. And in that insistence I found not only stability, but a deeper sense of peace within the very walls that had once felt uncertain beneath my feet. Several months passed before I fully understood what had changed in our home, and the realization came quietly one Saturday morning while I was standing at the kitchen window watching early sunlight settle across the lawn. Daniel was outside adjusting the sprinkler heads, measuring the distance carefully so the water would reach the edges without flooding the walkway, and Lauren stood beside him holding a tape measure, listening rather than directing. Their conversation was steady, cooperative. I felt no need to interpret it. I simply observed. Inside, the house no longer carried the faint tension that once lingered like a draft beneath a closed door. Conversations were open, documents were accessible, and when medical appointments were discussed, they were discussed with me present, not about me after I left the room. One evening Daniel asked whether I would consider transferring a portion of the property into a shared trust for long-term planning. Months earlier such a suggestion might have felt strategic, now it felt transparent. I asked questions. He answered them without impatience. Lauren provided printed projections and invited me to review them at my own pace. There were no brochures tucked beneath mail, no assumptions presented as certainty. We met with the financial planner together, and every document required my signature in person. I did not rush. I read each page carefully, the way Harold once taught me when we purchased this house, reminding me that ownership begins with understanding. After the meeting, Lauren approached me in the driveway and said she had learned something difficult through this process, that fear can disguise itself as competence, and that she had mistaken control for care. I listened without interruption. She did not expect immediate absolution. She simply acknowledged the truth. That acknowledgement mattered more than any apology. Daniel began checking in with me differently, not to verify my memory but to include my perspective. When holiday plans were discussed, he asked what traditions I wanted to keep. When grocery lists were made, Lauren asked whether I preferred the brand of coffee I have purchased for 20 years or whether I wished to try something new. Small details, but each one reinforced a boundary that had once been tested. I returned fully to my routines. My morning walks extended a little farther around the lake, sometimes 2.5 miles instead of 2. I joined a local book club and hosted one meeting in our living room, introducing Lauren as my daughter-in-law with no hesitation in my voice. Patricia visited occasionally as well. Our conversations remained cordial but measured. She never mentioned that night again, and I did not either. Some lessons do not require repetition. One afternoon Daniel found the old porcelain cup with the thin gold rim stored in the cabinet and asked whether I still wished to use it. I told him yes. I washed it carefully and placed it back in its familiar spot. The next time Lauren offered to make tea, she did so openly, reading the ingredients aloud before pouring hot water into the cup. I smiled and told her that transparency tastes better than honey. She smiled back, understanding the meaning beneath the words. I have not forgotten what happened. Memory is not something that fades simply because time passes, but I also understand that growth is possible when boundaries are clear and accountability is real. The house that once felt as though it were shifting beneath me now feels steady again. Not because nothing can change, but because I have established that I will not be repositioned without consent. Independence at 72 is not defiance. It is dignity. I remain here by choice, not by accident. And every morning when sunlight filters through the kitchen window and settles across the table where difficult truths were once spoken, I am reminded that being underestimated can be dangerous for those who do the underestimating. I may have silver hair and slower steps than I did 30 years ago, but my judgment remains intact, my signatures remain deliberate, and my presence in this home remains unquestioned. I am not fragile porcelain to be handled or replaced. I am the foundation upon which this household was built, and foundations, when properly reinforced, do not yield quietly to pressure.